The summer of 1886 had been merciless to Tombstone, Arizona. The silver mines that once promised fortune now yielded little more than dust and broken dreams. In this unforgiving landscape lived a man known simply as the Lonely Rancher, a weathered soul of 43 years who had retreated from the world after losing everything he once held dear. His small ranch sat on the outskirts of town, where the desert met civilization in an uneasy truce. The rancher had built his life around solitude, tending to his few remaining cattle and avoiding the chaos that plagued Tombstone streets. His days followed a rigid pattern: dawn chores, midday repairs, and evenings spent on his porch, watching the sun disappear behind the Dragoon Mountains. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." On this particular evening, as storm clouds gathered overhead, the rancher noticed something unusual: a piece of paper fluttering against his front door like a trapped bird. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the distant sound of revelry from the town's saloons. He approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. The note was written in shaky handwriting, the ink smeared by what appeared to be tears. "Please save my brother. He's running out of time. The old good-enough mine. Come alone. A desperate sister." The rancher's heart pounded as he read the words again. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, yet someone had chosen him, a recluse, as their last hope. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had given up on humanity was being asked to save it. Thunder rumbled overhead as he considered his options. The smart choice would be to ignore the plea, to return to his safe isolation. But something in those desperate words stirred memories he'd tried to bury, memories of his own brother, lost to the violence that plagued these frontier towns. The good-enough mine had been abandoned for 2 years, ever since a cave-in claimed 3 lives. Local folklore claimed it was cursed, but the rancher knew better. Mines weren't haunted by spirits. They were haunted by the greed and carelessness of men who valued silver more than human life. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the rancher made his decision. He saddled his horse, a sturdy mare named Esperanza, and loaded his rifle. The note had said to come alone, but he wasn't foolish enough to venture into an abandoned mine unarmed. The ride to the mine took him through Tombstone's main street, where the usual collection of cowboys, gamblers, and drifters sought shelter from the approaching storm. The Oriental saloon blazed with light, and the sound of piano music mixed with raucous laughter. None of these people knew about the desperate plea in his pocket, and he intended to keep it that way. Sheriff John Bean stood under the awning of his office, his badge catching the lamplight. The rancher had always respected Bean, despite the man's complicated reputation. The sheriff was honest in a town where honesty was often a liability, but he was also bound by laws that didn't always serve justice. As the rancher passed, their eyes met briefly. Bean tipped his hat, a gesture of recognition between 2 men who understood the weight of responsibility. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, an acknowledgement that this night would be different from all the others. The good-enough mine sat like a wound in the earth, its entrance yawning black against the storm-darkened sky. The rancher dismounted and approached on foot, his boots crunching on the scattered debris that surrounded the mine shaft. The wooden support beams were rotting, and warning signs posted by the mining company fluttered in the wind like funeral shrouds. A lantern glowed faintly from within the mine's depths, confirming that someone was indeed inside. The rancher lit his own lantern and stepped into the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of dripping water. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the tunnel walls. "I got your note." A young woman's voice answered from the shadows, trembling with fear and exhaustion. "Thank God you came. I didn't know who else to turn to." She emerged from a side tunnel, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows across her face. She couldn't have been more than 20, with auburn hair and eyes that held the weight of desperation. Her dress was torn and dirty, suggesting she'd been in the mine for some time. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother Tommy. They took him. They're going to kill him if I don't do what they want." The rancher studied her face, searching for signs of deception. In his experience, desperate people were capable of elaborate lies, but something in her eyes convinced him she was telling the truth. "Who took him?" he asked. "Men who work for Marcus Dalton," she replied, the name falling from her lips like a curse. "He owns half the businesses in town, including the bank and the largest saloon. He's been trying to force my family off our land for months." The rancher knew the name well. Marcus Dalton was Tombstone's most powerful businessman, a man who had arrived with the silver boom and accumulated wealth through methods that weren't always legal. He had a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of the cost to others. "What does he want from you?" the rancher asked. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded document. "He wants me to sign over our family's land. It's been in our family for 15 years, but he claims we owe money to his bank. The debt is fabricated, but he has judges and lawyers in his pocket." The rancher examined the document by lantern light. It was a deed transfer, already filled out except for Sarah's signature. The land in question was valuable. It sat near a water source that would be crucial for any future development in the area. "Where's your brother now?" he asked. "They're holding him in the basement of Dalton's saloon," Sarah replied. "But it's heavily guarded. I tried to get help from the sheriff, but Dalton has too much influence. No one wants to cross him." The rancher folded the document and handed it back to her. "Why did you choose me? I'm nobody special." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Because you're the only person in this town who doesn't owe Marcus Dalton anything. You live outside his reach, and people say you're honest. I heard about what happened to your family, how you lost everything trying to do the right thing. I hoped you might understand." The mention of his family hit the rancher like a physical blow. Few people knew the full story of his past, but apparently his reputation for integrity had survived even his self-imposed exile. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain began to pour through cracks in the mine's ceiling. The rancher made his decision with the same certainty that had guided him through countless dangerous situations. "I'll help you," he said simply. "But we're going to do this right. No rushing in with guns blazing. We need a plan." Sarah's face lit up with hope for the first time since he'd met her. "What do you have in mind?" The rancher smiled grimly. "First, we're going to pay a visit to someone who knows this town's secrets better than anyone else. Then we're going to give Marcus Dalton a choice he won't expect." As they prepared to leave the mine, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows. Someone who had followed the rancher and now knew about their meeting. The game was about to become far more dangerous than either of them realized. The storm had intensified by the time the rancher and Sarah reached the outskirts of Tombstone. Rain hammered the dusty streets, turning them into rivers of mud that reflected the amber glow of saloon windows. The rancher led Sarah through back alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Dalton's men might spot them. Their destination was a modest adobe house on the edge of Chinatown, where an elderly Chinese man named Chen Wei operated a small apothecary. To most of Tombstone's residents, Chen was simply the man who sold herbs and remedies for various ailments. But the rancher knew better. Chen Wei was one of the most well-informed individuals in the territory, with connections that stretched from the Mexican border to San Francisco. The rancher knocked on the door using a specific pattern, 3 quick raps, followed by 2 slow ones. It was a code Chen had taught him years ago, during a time when the rancher had needed information about the men who had destroyed his family. The door opened to reveal a slight man in his 60s, with intelligent eyes and hands stained by decades of working with medicinal plants. Chen's expression showed no surprise at seeing the rancher, despite the late hour and terrible weather. "Thomas," Chen said, using the rancher's real name, something few people in Tombstone knew. "I wondered when you would come. The wind carries whispers of trouble tonight." The rancher stepped inside, helping Sarah through the doorway. The interior of Chen's shop was warm and filled with the scent of dried herbs and burning incense. Shelves lined the walls, containing jars of mysterious substances and ancient-looking books written in Chinese characters. "Chen, this is Sarah Mitchell," the rancher said. Her brother's been taken by Marcus Dalton's men. I need to know everything you can tell me about Dalton's operation." Chen studied Sarah with the same careful attention he gave to his medicinal preparations. "Sit," he said, gesturing to cushions arranged around a low table. "Tea will help calm your spirit while we talk." As Chen prepared the tea, he spoke in measured tones. "Marcus Dalton is more dangerous than most people realize. His wealth comes not just from legitimate business, but from a network of illegal activities. He controls the flow of information in this town, and he has arrangements with certain lawmen that allow him to operate without interference." Sarah leaned forward anxiously. "What about my brother? Do you know where they're keeping him?" Chen nodded slowly. "The basement of the Crystal Palace Saloon has been converted into holding cells. Dalton uses them to persuade people who resist his business proposals. Your brother is not the first, and he will not be the last unless something changes." The rancher felt his jaw tighten. "How many men does he have guarding the place?" "Usually 4 or 5, but tonight there are more," Chen replied. "Word has spread that someone is asking questions about the Mitchell family. Dalton is taking precautions." Sarah's face paled. "Then it's hopeless. We can't fight that many men." "Fighting is not always the answer," Chen said, pouring steaming tea into delicate porcelain cups. "Sometimes the greatest victories come through wisdom rather than violence." The rancher accepted his cup, feeling the warmth spread through his hands. "What do you have in mind?" Chen smiled mysteriously. "Marcus Dalton has a weakness that few people know about. His entire operation depends on the cooperation of Judge Harrison, who signs the legal documents that make Dalton's land grabs appear legitimate. But Judge Harrison has a secret that could destroy him if it became public knowledge." "What kind of secret?" Sarah asked. "The judge has a gambling problem," Chen explained. "He owes substantial debts to certain individuals in San Francisco, debts that Dalton has been paying in exchange for favorable rulings. If those debts were suddenly called in, and if evidence of the arrangement became public, both men would face serious consequences." The rancher set down his cup, his mind working through the implications. "You're suggesting we blackmail them?" "I'm suggesting we give them an opportunity to make the right choice," Chen corrected. "Sometimes people need proper motivation to remember their moral obligations." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Chen moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. His expression grew serious. "Sheriff Bayan," he announced, "alone but armed." The rancher's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "Could be a trap." "No," Chen said firmly. "John Bayan is an honest man trapped in a corrupt system. If he's here, it's because he wants to help." Chen opened the door, and Sheriff Bayan stepped inside, water dripping from his coat. His weathered face was grim, and his eyes held the weight of difficult decisions. "Thomas," Bayan said, acknowledging the rancher with a nod. "I saw you riding toward the mine earlier. When I heard about the Mitchell boy, I put 2 and 2 together." Sarah stood up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Sheriff, can you help us? They have my brother and—" Bayan held up a hand. "Miss, I know about your situation. I also know that my hands are tied by politics and corruption that run deeper than most people realize. But that doesn't mean I'm powerless." The sheriff turned to the rancher. "I can't officially sanction what you're planning, but I can make sure that certain people are distracted when you make your move. I can also ensure that any evidence you uncover receives proper attention from authorities outside of Tombstone." "What's the catch?" the rancher asked. "No unnecessary violence," Bayan replied firmly. "This town has seen enough bloodshed. If we're going to clean up this mess, we do it the right way." Chen refilled the teacups and gestured for everyone to sit. "Then we need a plan that serves justice without creating more victims." For the next hour, the unlikely group worked out the details of their strategy. Chen would use his network of contacts to gather evidence of the illegal arrangement between Dalton and Judge Harrison. Sheriff Bayan would create a distraction that would draw most of Dalton's men away from the Crystal Palace Saloon. The rancher and Sarah would use the diversion to rescue Tommy and secure the evidence needed to expose the corruption. "There's one more thing," Chen said as they prepared to leave. "Marcus Dalton has a daughter, Elizabeth. She's been away at school in San Francisco, but she returned to Tombstone 3 days ago. She doesn't know about her father's illegal activities, and she has a reputation for being compassionate and fair-minded." Sarah frowned. "How does that help us?" "Sometimes the greatest pressure comes from within one's own family," Chen replied. "If Elizabeth Dalton learned the truth about her father's business practices, she might be able to influence him in ways that outsiders cannot." The rancher considered this information. "Where can we find her?" "She's staying at the Grand Hotel," Behan said, "but approaching her directly would be risky. Dalton has men watching her, supposedly for her protection." "Leave that to me," Chen said. "I have ways of delivering messages that avoid unwanted attention." As the storm began to subside, the group prepared to put their plan into action. The rancher checked his weapons and supplies, while Sarah wrote a letter to Elizabeth Dalton, explaining the situation and asking for her help. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked the rancher as they prepared to leave Chen's shop. "You're risking everything for people you barely know." The rancher looked at her with eyes that held years of pain and regret. "I failed to save my own brother when he needed me most. I won't make that mistake again." Sheriff Behan placed a hand on the rancher's shoulder. "Thomas, what happened to your family wasn't your fault. You were outnumbered and outgunned. Sometimes the best a man can do is survive to fight another day." "Maybe," the rancher replied. "But tonight we have a chance to make things right. That's more than I've had in a long time." As they stepped back into the night, none of them noticed the figure watching from across the street. One of Dalton's men who had been following the sheriff. Their carefully laid plans were about to face an unexpected complication. The race against time had begun, and the stakes were higher than any of them realized. Dawn was still hours away when the rancher and Sarah positioned themselves across from the Crystal Palace saloon. The building stood like a monument to excess in the heart of Tombstone, its ornate facade hiding the darker activities that took place in its basement. Piano music and laughter drifted from the upper floors, where Dalton's customers remained blissfully unaware of the human suffering below. Sheriff Behan's distraction had worked perfectly. A staged fight between two drunken cowboys in front of the Oriental Saloon had drawn most of Dalton's security away from the Crystal Palace. Only 2 guards remained at their posts, one at the front entrance and another at the side door that led to the basement. "Remember," the rancher whispered to Sarah, "once we're inside, stay close and follow my lead. If something goes wrong, get out and find Chen. He'll know what to do." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. In her hand, she clutched a small derringer that the rancher had given her. Not much against professional gunmen, but better than nothing. The rancher had studied the building's layout during his earlier reconnaissance. The basement entrance was accessible through a narrow alley that ran behind the saloon. If they could neutralize the guard quietly, they would have a clear path to the holding cells. Moving like shadows, they approached the alley. The guard was leaning against the wall, smoking a cigarette and looking bored. The rancher crept closer, using the sound of rain and distant thunder to mask his approach. In one swift motion, he struck the guard with the butt of his rifle, catching the man as he fell unconscious. "Is he?" Sarah began. "He'll live," the rancher assured her, dragging the guard into the shadows. "But he'll have a headache for a week." The basement door was locked, but the rancher had come prepared. Using tools Chen had provided, he worked on the lock while Sarah kept watch. The mechanism clicked open just as voices echoed from the main street, Dalton's men returning from the distraction. They slipped inside and found themselves in a narrow corridor lined with wooden doors. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and fear. Muffled sounds came from behind several of the doors, other victims of Dalton's persuasion methods. "Tommy?" Sarah called softly. A weak voice answered from the third door. "Sarah? Is that really you?" The rancher examined the lock, newer and more sophisticated than the exterior door. As he worked, Sarah spoke to her brother through the wooden barrier. "We're going to get you out of here," she promised. "Just hold on a little longer." "Sarah, you shouldn't have come." Tommy's voice was strained with pain and exhaustion. "It's too dangerous. Dalton's men, they're not just trying to steal our land. There's something bigger happening here." The lock clicked open, and the rancher pushed the door wide. Tommy Mitchell was a young man of perhaps 18, with the same auburn hair as his sister. His face was bruised and his clothes were torn, but his eyes still held defiance. "What do you mean, something bigger?" the rancher asked, helping Tommy to his feet. Tommy winced as he stood. "I overheard them talking. Dalton isn't just stealing land for himself. He's working with a group of investors from back east, railroad men who want to build a new line through this territory. They need to control specific parcels of land, and they're willing to do anything to get them." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's why he's been so persistent about our property. It's not just about the water rights." "There's more," Tommy continued. "Judge Harrison isn't the only official on their payroll. They have people in the territorial government, maybe even in Washington. This goes all the way to the top." The rancher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp basement air. If Tommy was right, they weren't just fighting local corruption. They were up against a conspiracy that could reach the highest levels of government. Footsteps echoed in the corridor above them. Dalton's men had discovered the unconscious guard. "We need to move," the rancher said. "Is there another way out of here?" Tommy nodded weakly. "There's a tunnel that connects to the old mine workings. Dalton uses it to move people and goods without being seen. It comes out near the cemetery." They made their way deeper into the basement, past cells containing other prisoners, men and women whose only crime had been standing in the way of Dalton's ambitions. The rancher's jaw tightened as he saw the conditions these people were being held in. "We can't leave them," Sarah said, echoing his thoughts. "We'll come back for them," the rancher promised. "But right now, we need to get Tommy to safety and expose what's happening here." The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the basement's deepest chamber. As they opened it, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Dalton's men had found the basement entrance and were searching the cells. The tunnel was narrow and partially flooded, forcing them to move in single file through knee-deep water. The rancher led the way, his lantern casting eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of doors being kicked open. "How much farther?" Sarah asked, supporting her weakened brother. "Not far," Tommy replied. "The tunnel branches ahead. One path leads to the cemetery, the other to the old Good-Enough mine." As they reached the junction, the rancher made a decision that would change everything. Instead of heading toward the cemetery and safety, he turned toward the mine. "Where are you going?" Sarah demanded. "To end this," the rancher replied grimly. "Chen should have the evidence we need by now. It's time to bring everything into the light." They emerged from the tunnel into the same chamber where the rancher had first met Sarah. But now it was occupied by an unexpected group. Chen Wei, Sheriff Bean, and a young woman in an elegant dress who could only be Elizabeth Dalton. "Thomas," Chen said, relief evident in his voice. "We were beginning to worry." Elizabeth Dalton stepped forward, her face a mask of shock and determination. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded the rancher of her father, but without the coldness that marked Marcus Dalton's gaze. "Mr. Rancher," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Mr. Chen has told me some disturbing things about my father's business practices. I need to know if they're true." The rancher looked at Tommy, who nodded weakly. "Tell her everything," the young man said. "She deserves to know what her father has become." As the rancher recounted what they had discovered, Elizabeth's face grew pale. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, staring at the evidence Chen had gathered, documents, photographs, and witness statements that painted a damning picture of corruption and violence. "I knew something was wrong," she said finally. "Father has changed since I went away to school. He's become harder, more ruthless. But I never imagined—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sheriff Bean stepped forward. "Miss Dalton, we need your help. Your father has too much influence for us to move against him directly. But if you were to confront him with this evidence, if you were to demand that he make things right, he might listen to me," Elizabeth finished. "Or he might see me as another obstacle to remove." The rancher studied her face, seeing the same courage that had driven Sarah to risk everything for her brother. "The choice is yours," he said. "But those people in the basement cells don't have much time, and there are probably others in similar situations throughout the territory. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, and in that moment, she looked every inch her father's daughter, but with a moral strength that Marcus Dalton had long since abandoned. "Then we end this tonight," she said. "All of it." As they prepared to leave the mine, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the tunnel entrance. Marcus Dalton himself, who had followed his daughter and now knew exactly what they were planning. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. The Crystal Palace saloon had never seen a night like this one. As the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky, an unlikely procession approached the building's main entrance. Elizabeth Dalton led the way, her elegant dress a stark contrast to the rough frontier clothing of her companions. Behind her walked the rancher, Sheriff Bayan, Chen Wei, and the Mitchell siblings, each carrying evidence that would either transform Tombstone or destroy them all. Marcus Dalton was waiting for them in the saloon's main room, surrounded by his remaining men. He sat at his usual table like a king holding court, but his eyes betrayed the desperation of a man whose empire was crumbling. The room fell silent as his daughter entered, followed by the group he now recognized as his greatest threat. "Elizabeth," Dalton said, his voice carefully controlled. "I was wondering where you'd gone. It's dangerous for a young lady to be out so late, especially in such questionable company." Elizabeth walked to the center of the room, her head held high. "Father, we need to talk. About your business practices, about the people you're holding prisoner in the basement, about the corruption that's poisoning this entire territory." Dalton's facade cracked slightly. "I don't know what lies these people have been filling your head with, but they're not lies," Elizabeth interrupted, producing the documents Chen had gathered. "I've seen the evidence, the forged deeds, the bribes to Judge Harrison, the illegal detention of innocent people. How could you become this?" The rancher watched the exchange with growing tension. Dalton's men were positioned throughout the room, their hands hovering near their weapons. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the situation would explode into violence. "You don't understand the pressures I face," Dalton said, standing slowly. "This territory is changing. The railroad is coming, and fortunes will be made or lost based on who controls the right land. I'm securing our family's future. By destroying other families?" Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. "By terrorizing innocent people? By turning this town into your personal kingdom?" Dalton's eyes hardened as he looked at Sarah. "The Mitchell girl, I should have known you were behind this. Your family's stubbornness has caused nothing but trouble." "Their stubbornness in refusing to be robbed," Sheriff Bayan corrected, his hand resting on his gun. "Marcus, it's over. We have enough evidence to bring down your entire operation. The territorial governor is already aware of the situation, and federal marshals are on their way." The rancher saw Dalton's men tense at this news. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and any sudden movement could trigger a bloodbath. "You're bluffing," Dalton said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Chen Wei stepped forward, his calm presence somehow diffusing the tension in the room. "Mr. Dalton, you have a choice to make. You can continue down this path of violence and corruption, destroying your daughter's respect and your own soul in the process. Or you can choose redemption." "Redemption?" Dalton laughed bitterly. "From a Chinese herb dealer? You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know about second chances," Chen replied quietly. "I know about men who have lost their way and found it again. The question is, what kind of man do you want to be when your daughter remembers you?" Elizabeth moved closer to her father, tears streaming down her face. "Papa, please, I remember the man you used to be, the man who taught me about honor and justice. That man is still inside you somewhere." For a moment, the room held its breath. The rancher could see the internal struggle playing out on Dalton's face, the battle between the corrupt businessman he had become and the father he still wanted to be. Then Dalton's expression hardened again. "You've all made a terrible mistake coming here. Did you really think I'd let you destroy everything I've built?" He gestured to his men, who began to draw their weapons. But before violence could erupt, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "That's enough!" Judge Harrison stood in the saloon's doorway, flanked by two federal marshals. The judge looked haggard and defeated, but there was relief in his eyes, the relief of a man finally free from an unbearable burden. "I've confessed everything to the federal authorities," Harrison announced. "The bribes, the forged documents, the illegal land seizures. It's over, Marcus." Dalton stared at the judge in shock. "You fool. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've done what I should have done months ago," Harrison replied. "I've chosen justice over corruption." The federal marshals moved into the room, their presence immediately changing the dynamics. Dalton's men, faced with federal authority, slowly raised their hands in surrender. "Marcus Dalton," one of the marshals announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, kidnapping, and corruption of public officials." As the marshals moved to arrest him, Dalton looked at his daughter one last time. "Elizabeth, I did this for you, for our family." Elizabeth shook her head sadly. "No, Papa, you did this for yourself, but it's not too late to make things right." The rancher watched as Dalton was led away in shackles, his empire crumbling around him. But the night's work wasn't finished yet. "The prisoners in the basement," Sarah reminded them. Sheriff Bain nodded. "Already taken care of. My deputies are releasing them now and providing medical attention to those who need it." Over the next several hours, as dawn gave way to full daylight, the true scope of Dalton's operation became clear. Dozens of people had been illegally detained or coerced into signing away their property. Families who had lost their homes were given the opportunity to reclaim them. The territorial government launched a full investigation into the railroad conspiracy, leading to arrests in multiple states. But perhaps the most significant change came from Elizabeth Dalton herself. Using her inheritance and her father's legitimate business holdings, she established a fund to compensate the victims of his crimes. She also worked with Sheriff Bean and the territorial authorities to implement new safeguards against corruption. 3 months later, the rancher stood on his porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. His isolation had been broken, not by force, but by choice. The experience had reminded him that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from facing down armed enemies, but from opening one's heart to the possibility of redemption. A rider approached from town, Sarah Mitchell, who had become a regular visitor since her family's land had been restored. She dismounted and joined him on the porch, carrying news from Tombstone. "Elizabeth received a letter from her father today," Sarah reported. "He's been transferred to a federal prison in California, but he's been cooperating with the investigation. They've uncovered corruption in 3 other territories." The rancher nodded. "And how is she handling it?" "Better than expected," Sarah replied. "She's thrown herself into the work of rebuilding what her father destroyed. The town council has asked her to run for mayor in the next election." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The desert had not changed, but the people who lived in it had been transformed by the events of that stormy night. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Getting involved, I mean." "Your quiet life was simpler." The rancher considered the question. "Simpler, yes, but not better. I spent years thinking that isolation would protect me from pain. What I learned is that it also protected me from joy, from purpose, from the connections that make life worth living." A month later, the rancher received an unexpected visitor. Chen Wei arrived at sunset, carrying a letter with an official seal. "From the territorial governor," Chen announced, handing over the envelope. The rancher read the letter twice before its contents fully sank in. The governor was offering him a position as a federal marshal, with jurisdiction over cases involving corruption and organized crime throughout the territory. "What do you think?" the rancher asked Chen. The old man smiled. "I think that sometimes the best lawmen are those who understand what it means to lose everything and find it again. The territory needs men like you, men who can't be bought or intimidated." The rancher looked out at the desert, then at the letter in his hands. For years, he had run from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of making a difference. But that night in Tombstone had taught him something important. True strength comes not from standing alone, but from standing with others in the service of justice. "When do I start?" he asked. As the sun set on another day in the Arizona Territory, the lonely rancher was lonely no more. He had found his purpose, his community, and his redemption in the most unlikely of places, in the desperate plea of a stranger and the courage to answer that call. The legend of that night would spread throughout the territory and beyond, inspiring others to stand up against corruption and injustice. But for the man who had once been known as the Lonely Rancher, the greatest reward was simpler. He had learned to trust again, to hope again, and to believe that one person's choice to do right could change everything. In the end, it wasn't the guns or the gold that mattered. It was the connections between people, the courage to stand for justice, and the understanding that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to seek it. The desert wind carried the sound of laughter from the town, where families reunited and communities healed, and somewhere in that wind was the promise that tomorrow would be better than today, because good people had chosen to make it so. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.